which came out about 2 or 3 months ago. Didn't get much press and died a natural death because people didn't really want to look at the issues. So we're going to talk about that in today's context of the budget, because the budget really has to consider, the fact that us as baby boomers, most of us here, are really going to be the big burden on society potentially in 10 or 20 years' time. But fortunately for most of the people in this group, we've actually looked after ourselves pretty well. So it's really the rest of Australia that's got the problem. Canberra's actually very well superannuated, and it's got a fairly high level of affluence as well. So we're probably one of the best groups in Australia to do what the government wants us to do and look after ourselves. So we'll just look at the intergeneration report, just in the context of the lucky generation, because I thought about this the other day and thinking that really the key thing for us as baby boomers is that we grew up in very unprecedented times. The last 50, 60 years has seen so many changes, so many positive changes, that you can't go back in history anywhere in the world and see such positive changes. And they're just economic, they're medical, they're transport technology, education and diversity of recreation and housing. Never seen such change across a wide range of the whole society, actually, over time. And this just gives you an idea of the affluence increase. So over time, we've roughly been increasing our affluence by 1 or 2% a year. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, but over 10 years, that's 10, 20%. Here in the early 2000s, we were growing at, our real wealth was going up around 3% a year. And we forget that. It's a cumulative thing. You buy a little bit better car each year. You get a kitchen and you make it in, get a 20 grand kitchen when 10 years ago you might have only afford to buy a 10 grand kitchen. All these things accumulate over time. So the key thing is that now our generation particularly has got the wealth. We've ridden the housing boom, and if you look at this graph up here, you'll see this dark line, non-financial assets. That's our housing assets. And we've really ridden that asset boom because we bought houses when they were relatively cheap. They were lesser quality. I mean, if we go back to the days of the old Gubby house in Canberra, it was about 11.75 squares rather. Now the average house in Canberra is about 22 squares. So literally in, say, the 40-year period when we've lived, we've actually doubled the size of our houses. We've also now got ducted heating when there used to be just literally the old oil heaters or electric heaters. We've got insulation, not Mr. Fluffy hopefully, but most people have got more, the house insulated, so they're actually easy to cool and heat. We've got air conditioning in most houses. These are all come in the last 20, 30 years as we've actually retrofitted our houses to improve them. But along the way, we've actually ridden the tide of that wealth, that housing in Australia is one of the most expensive in the world. And also on the other side of the coin, we've got very good quality housing. If you go to America, you see their houses, they fall apart in 20 years because they're mostly timber. The other asset is our financial assets, and that's basically our superannuation, because that's where we've accumulated over the last 20 years, $2.9 trillion in wealth. And the key thing there is that that's basically mostly concentrated in the baby boom generation, because we've had that 20, 30 years of working. Our debt's gone up, but not substantially, so we'll go back there. Not substantially, there's a bit of increase in debt, but we're really relatively, when you look at this wealth, we're looking pretty good on the wealth aspects. So coming back to it, I'll go back there. The key thing is we've got pretty good affluence, and we're looking pretty good on our assets as well. So what we're going to look at is just some of the improvements, because if we go back over the last 50, 60 years, there's just been massive improvements. And if we go back to the 50s, the first generation, we were the first generation to live with low infant mortality. Now, most people forget it, but things like polio, whooping cough, smallpox, scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, meningitis, literally unheard of today, but probably everyone in this room would know someone who's had polio in their youth. Pretty much that's disappeared now. But these diseases were actually knocking out a large percentage of the population, child population, in the 20s and the 30s, and if you go back before that. Because those diseases would knock out quite a few people. Roughly a third of children wouldn't get to 21 in those days. prior to the advent of the Sabin vaccine for polio, but the big one was antibiotics, developed during the Second World War and became more and more available after the Second World War. So those sort of things really started to get controlled, and therefore we don't have the child mortality we have today. And that's one of the things that's added to actual life expectancy. It's not that people who lived to, once you got to 21, you had a pretty good life expectancy. Most people did live into their 50s and 60s. Now we're living into the 70s, 80s, but what pulled down life expectancy in total was a lot of children died before they got to 21. So hygiene was another thing. Sewage is, you probably forget that in the 60s we started to sewer a lot of the older suburbs in Australia. The night saw man used to come and take away your sewage. That's obviously got sewered back in the 60s, but we'll come to that. But just better surgery, hygiene techniques all came into vogue. And now the schooling, over time, in the last 100 years, the time people spend in school has just gone through the roof. Back in the 1900s, people basically went to school for 5 years. Now it's 20 years. The gradual increase in schooling has just been one of the things that's never happened before, because in the past you used to be wealthy and the wealthy used to get the education and no one else basically got the education. But today we're getting education from the mass of people. The next thing is we have what we call teenagehood. That became the first generation to have a teenagehood. Most generations before that went from school straight to work, but they were going to work in their early teenage years. They weren't going to work when they're 17, 18, 19, 20, or 21, 22 these days. They were going to do work when they're 12 and 13. So the concept of a teenagehood is only very modern. It's quite a new concept. And the concept of having children for 10 years in teenagehood at school is completely modern. And we forget that, and that they create their own demand for consumer clothing and recreation sport equipment that's never happened before. Music, obviously new forms of music came in with the electric guitar, for instance. That was a new invention. Electric guitar, amplifiers, all that sort of thing. Then we had the migration from other cultures in Europe, primarily initially, and then we went to Greece, then we went to Lebanon, and then to Vietnam, and now we've got the Middle Eastern people coming. So we've had a whole range of new cultures come into our society, which in the past, you see, migration had to have good transport systems. The biggest migration before we've had these days is in Roman times. Roman times was when they had great roads, and you could get from one part of the empire to the other part of the empire, and that's the only time we really had mass migration. They could get somebody who lived in Syria who could migrate to England. They're actually tracing people's genetic history now in England. They find they've got ancestry that goes back to the Middle East, and think, well, how do these people get there? Well, it's because going back to Roman times, these people moved. So going to the 60s now, the biggest affluent decade of the 20th century was the 60s. We had the lowest unemployment. We had a boom. It was a huge boom. There was only 2% unemployment in the 60s. So that created a number of things. We had started to get mass-produced televisions, radios, cars, the mass-produced things coming out of Japan. Radios and cars came out of there. The use of plastics. First time we've ever had plastics. Now plastics, we forget about this, but plastics have made lots of things cheaper. To mould and to produce something so easily from a plastic and cheaply has never been done before. So something about so simple as plastics to use as containers, to use in furniture, cars, never been done before. If you go back to the 50s, you didn't see any really plastics in cars. They're all metal, pretty much, and leather. Detergents, another one. Detergents come from petroleum. Petroleum was the whole drive of the use of detergents. So before that, you used to have to use soap when you washed up. But the real thing what the thing was that the economic recovery had really kicked in by the 60s, and that was one of the things that enhanced the boom, was that the world had got over the Second World War.
Biro.
Sorry?
I just did biro pens.
That's right. Oh, that's another one. Yeah, Count Bick, Count Bick invented that. The other things we came back to was you could use transportable radios. Now, remember in the 30s and 20s, people huddled around the family radio and listened to Blue Hills or whatever it was. Well, you had a transportable one now. You had a little round transistor. When they actually wrote that down to a small size, you could actually take it to the races with you. You could take it to the football with you. Record players became small. You could have your record player in your own room. So these things that you forget about them, but they're something that's already happened. So they're all added to our wealth and our way we live. And then we've got the baby boomers. The education levels were raised over time, and as we got more educated, we were able to pay ourselves better. That's a key thing. If you're more educated, you can do things much more cleverly, hopefully. And that's another thing that was, with mass education, we got then better educated population who then could do much better or much more sophisticated things. First wide-body aircraft, the 707 came in. Now that started to allow people to travel to Australia, not by ship, but they came by aircraft. The first migrations of large mass migration by aircraft. Then the 70s come along, and then we had the equal wages for women, and of course we had Gough Whitlam introducing a major social welfare increases for unemployment. But the big one for women was equal wages, and also they weren't, after the Second World War, they were excluded out of the workforce. Once you got married, your mothers would have had to stop work, because once you got married, you weren't allowed to keep your employment. Now, equal wages, equal opportunity for women to get into the workforce. And then the universities opened up. So the first time we've actually had middle and lower class people going to universities. Never happened before. And also you could study part-time. You could do it at night, whereas before you had to attend lectures during the day. So these are all major changes. Then we got the 70s, we got the 747. We got the 747 aircraft, which is even roughly double the size of the 707. So then you could have mass overseas tourism. First time people would go overseas to either retire, go overseas and see Europe and see America. So these are sort of things. Medical technology on heart attack, stroke, cancer started to come in. We talked about sewage before. All the suburbs in the inner areas of Sydney became sewage. And it was only because of the backhoe. Because before that, if you wanted to dig a hole, you got a team of 8 to 10 or 15 people, and they started to dig. So if you dug the foundations for your house, you got a team of people in digging the foundations. But it was just too expensive to dig sewers, because sewers are 6 to 8 feet down below the ground. To dig sewers 10 to 15 kilometres down through all the suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne, too expensive until you got the backhoe. So small invention, but it has major impacts on hygiene and health. Textiles and clothing, footwear. We're going back to the 1980s. Was the time of Hawke and Keating, opened up the economy, became a free market economy. We dropped our tariffs on textiles, clothing, footwear, and to a certain extent cars. We've got one of the most competitive car industries in the world now, in the sense that pretty much every car in the world is available here. Producing much cheaper cars, better quality cars. It didn't really cut in for the cars in reducing their pricing, but through the 90s, it actually did the tariff cuts through the 80s and 90s, but over time now we've roughly dropped the cost of our cars by about a third. And we're getting a lot more in them. We're getting electric seats, we get side mirrors and all that sort of stuff. All those things have come through. The Australian dollar's floated. Now most people think, oh, who cares? The point with that is it's a major economic stabiliser. So when we had the resources boom, the Australian dollar went up. Allowed us to buy things overseas cheaply, but it also put a restriction on the boom here in Australia, because it allowed a lot more imports in competition, and that kept the prices of things down. If we didn't have the dollar as a stabiliser, you would have seen prices go up through the resources boom. because the domestic manufacturers could have raised their prices. But the exchange rate went up, meant the competition was harder for domestic producers. But now the resource boom's over. It's giving our domestic industries a lift because they've got a now 20-30% benefit from the exchange rate. Deregulation of the banking sector. We had a very conservative banking sector, but they opened that to foreign competition. They didn't really last that long. You know, you had companies like Bank of Canada and a few companies came in, tried to do the retail banking. They weren't successful, so they went into what we call corporate banking. So they didn't really touch the lives of most people, but it allowed a lot more competition in the banking sector. Now, all that means that all this change in the 80s was that it deregulated the economy, did the things that needed to be done through Hawke and Keating, and it resulted in that our wealth has gone up roughly 20% in GDP terms. So we're roughly 20% better off because of those changes. This is one of the things we have problems with governments. If they're going to change something, they're going to upset somebody. And of course, textiles, clothing and footwear, there was thousands of people, particularly in Victoria, who employed those industries. And they had major restructuring programs to get people out of those industries. When they got redundant, they had retraining, they gave them support. But they allowed them to move into industries where they were probably better paid and perhaps much more less dangerous work and boring work. So, but you move people out of low-value industries into high-value industries, the whole society's better off. And that's what's happened in Australia. We've actually done very well over those last 20, 30 years in changing our economy. Could do better, but a place like Japan hasn't done much. And that's why they're still in recession after 20 years, well, 25 years actually. They started recession in 1991, and they're still in recession. They don't change, they won't change. It's they don't want to lose face.
Well, Russell, who's above us that's driving the OECD?
That'd be Germany, primarily. Germany has a lot more structural reform. US has very good structural reforms, but they've got a very open economy as well. Yeah, mainly Germany in there. So then they came to the 1990s, and we also had the compulsory super system, which we know now is really starting to kick in and gives people decent super. Of course, Canberra's about 20 years in front of that, because most people had good super from the day they started work. And not only 9.5%, there was roughly 15 to 16% contribution from the employer from the day you started work. So Canberra is probably 10, 15 years in front of the rest of Australia, in the sense that the wealth we have in our superannuation in Canberra is well above the average in Australia. But now we're going to have people who are going to retire with a decent lump sum. Now we have the mobile phone. Huge improvements in efficiency for everyone. Not only from tradesmen who are going around and getting doing your washing machine or fixing up your home things. They can ring ahead and say, oh, I'll be late, or I'll have to defer the appointment. Salespeople on the road, they could ring into their employer and say, oh, I'll be late, or whatever. Trucking industries. Mobile phones, huge improvement in efficiency there to help people. The other thing was let's get the right one. Just go back. The miniaturisation of the mobile phone, so you can actually carry it. They started off with big bricks, and you couldn't actually hold it in your hand. Then it went into, and as you know now, we now have got the cameras on them, and they've got computing capacity, the smartphone. So again, another jump in technology. So if we look at, going back to the VCR, I think it was about 1975 that came out. Somebody's probably got some old VCRs around, but PlayStations, the Polaroid, the laptop now is nearly becoming redundant, because now people use iPhones, video cameras. All these things are just, they're only 20, 30 years old, a lot of them, and we now can pretty much put them all into a mobile phone. So we've had huge increases in affluence. We live better, but the whole thing is that so much change. Just the internet now has put out so many industries, printing, libraries, they're going out of fashion. Postal services, out of fashion. Bookshops. So a lot of these technologies are improving things, but also some industries are having to contract. So we've seen that there is such massive improvements in technology has led to better health, better wealth, and we just have to consider now this in the context of intergenerational equity, because if we've had such a good run, what's going to happen for our kids? Mainly because they're going to have to buy very expensive houses, that's the biggest problem. But secondly, they're going to have to fund some of the retirement costs of our living in retirement. But barring no major world wars, we've had no major health epidemics, and we've had no major environmental problems yet through climate change. We've been lucky. But we can't really expect that to go on. You know, you don't, if you go back in history, 1,000 years of history, you get good periods and you get bad periods. It just doesn't go on forever. So really the big question now is how are we going to pay for retirement for the baby boomers, ourselves, and how the government's going to pay for the medical support in particular. So the big driver is life expectancy. So we know that over time, if you retire in 1905, you get out roughly 50, 60 years. As I said, that's a bit distorted because of child mortality, but it probably is a bit higher than that. But life expectancy is still going to expect to rise over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, as we still getting more improvements in health and knowledge about our lifestyle, you know, what foods to eat, that sort of stuff. But the big issue is the portion of people in the population who are going to be over 65. So currently around 15%, then going up to nearly 25%. But the big issue is this, the number of people over 85. Now when you're 85, you're not going to be in 100% health, so it's going to be the big burden on the health system. Currently, not a huge proportion in the population over 85. So the problem is we've got currently about 4.5 people in the workforce supporting one person retired, and over time getting to less than 3. So roughly about a third drop in those people to support us. And that's the issue, it's the health costs. Roughly 3% of gross national product going into things like pharmaceutical benefits, hospitals, private health insurance, but that's just going to really go through the roof in the next 10 or 20 years. And this is just showing you where the spending when you by age group, and you can see here where the spending's going from over 65, that's where it's really ramping up. It's not kids, they don't basically cost too much. It's not adults in their working lives, it's when you retire, that's when you start to get into the health care system. As we know, the age pension, and this is where it comes to governments getting concerned, age pension has been set at 65 for males since 1905. Hasn't changed until recently, until we're pushing up to 67. They're saying it's 70 here, I'm not sure if that's correct, I don't think they've actually changed it yet. But eventually I think they will, because life expectancy is just going so much higher. And you just can't expect people to live 30 years in retirement on the government. You're going to have to expect people to live only maybe 20 years in retirement on government benefits. And again, here we're looking at medical expenditures, the big ramp up in age 65 expenditures. So roughly going from around 5% of GDP currently to, this is only since 1989, up to about 8%. So that's where the costs are coming in. And then the healthcare again, just showing you what government spending's looking like in 35 years' time. It's the health costs that really the big blowout. Aged care is going to double. This one is really where it's pushing up into a large percentage of government spending. Education not changing much, even the age pension service is not changing that much, primarily because they're trying to get people to live in their own home a lot longer before they go to retirement homes. And you can see here the problem with the government. The taxation comes from people working, and the costs come from people who are retired. Even kids in school are not costing us that much in total spending for the governments. It's just this ramp up in the aged care sector. And this is just a projection of what governments have to change their spending habits over the next 15 years to get back to covering the costs of retirees as baby boomers. And Australia's up there reasonably high in the proportion of money we've got to dedicate to spending on the baby boomers, or increase the taxation basically in the baby boomer generation to cover things in the costs. Other countries are a lot worse off, but at least we're tackling it with their superannuation system. The good news though is that we're getting a lot more people off full pensions. So that's 60% going back to 2007. It's dropping quite rapidly. So currently only about 50% are on full pensions. By 2030, roughly only about 35% on full pensions. So the government has, with superannuation, it is helping, but you're still seeing that the people who are fully funded are still only 20% of the population. That really should be going up. It's not. The people are really going from full pension to part pension. So it's not really helping the government that much well, helping the government something, but it's not really getting a big benefit by having a lot more people looking after retirement. So people who live comfortably in retirement, around 58,000. I think that's a bit high for Canberra. I find it's about 45 to 50. But the big issue is if you want to enjoy retirement, you're going to have that sort of money to be able to go to a restaurant and movies and theatre and whatever. Whereas a person who's very modest, I don't really see anyone living on this amount of money, but they have just less money to spend on entertainment. And that's really the key thing. You've looked after yourself. You can actually have that comfortable retirement and enjoy the fruits of the benefits. So the intergeneration report says there's a massive issue for governments coming up. They cannot support the cost of shouldering all the burden, and that's why they've got the superannuation system, but it's going to be that someone's going to miss out, and it's people who don't prepare for retirement. So basically the next 2 or 3 decades in retirement are the ones where you should be enjoying yourself. So most of you people here have provided yourself well, so you should be able to enjoy it. But really what we're saying is that a lot of people are going to miss out if they don't look after themselves. So now I'll put that in context of the budget, because as I said, the budget's there to try and tax us to provide our services, but if we've got spending more than we're actually being taxed, eventually there's a problem. And you can go to Greece to find how that works. But there's a lot of countries in Europe, not only Greece, who actually spend a lot more than they bring in revenue, but Greece is probably the tip of the iceberg. France has had 23 years in a row where they've had a budget deficit. They're running up their deficit like crazy. So does Spain. But those countries haven't really hit a wall yet. But really we don't want to hit a wall, and that's because it creates too much economic problems. But the real issue here is that the government has been trying to reduce the spending, roughly reducing by 14 billion, but they've put 10 billion new spending into the budget. So basically what they're saying is they're not really doing much. And they can't do much because the Senate won't allow anyone to be any worse off, basically. And the government's not brave enough now to do much in the way of cutting back, except for the age pension. And there's a little change which will come to in child support. But they're spending money on things that are positive. So obviously reducing company tax for small companies gives people a bit more incentive to work in a business, and that $20,000 write-off for new equipment. Interesting to see how that goes. It's probably going to get a lot more businesses sort of thinking about spending and developing their businesses. I think it's quite a cheap way of doing it. The government's got interest rates are at historic lows. Got a very good currency, so we should actually be a better economy than they are. But it's because we're coming off a resource boom. But things like having drought relief for farmers up in Queensland particularly, I mean that's just a band-aid solution for the farming community. But the Northern Development Infrastructure Fund, well that potentially is really trying to replace some of the infrastructure spent on the resource sector. A lot of the resource sector is in the northern parts of Australia, and they really need the infrastructure to keep that sectors going. And national security, that's obviously a big area where the government needs to keep the spending up, and childcare because of the revamp of the childcare system. But the net result is that we're going to have around 25.9% of the GDP spent by the federal government, And that's about 1.5% above the Howard years. Now, it doesn't sound much, but it's important because you see governments will crowd out the private sector, and the private sector is generally the ones which one pays the taxes. So if you crowd out the private sector, there's not the taxes to come in. So the budget, the Howard, under the Abbott government, they are cutting back on revenue, but their revenue growth is a little bit more than their spending compared to, say, the Gillard government. Howard was not too bad, he was actually getting more revenue than spending, but the problem has come is that this is a big collapse in revenue after the resources boom. This collapse of 25% down to 22% of GDP, a 3% drop in revenue is where the problem is. It's not so much spending, it's just the revenue has collapsed underneath the spending. Spending is generally fairly consistent. There has been a ramp up here a bit. This is NDIS spending and also the Gonski report, the education one, but that's been pulled back a bit. So we're really now trying to get the revenue to come back up again to normal, and that's the projection. That's the problem, is that we're still down here in a very low amount of revenue coming in for the government. So what we're trying to do is get the budget back to surplus. Unfortunately, we've had the Rudd years and the Gillard years where there was a lot of spending and really put us into a lot of debt. But poor old Wayne Swan, he was trying to get us back in this budget surplus, but he didn't get there because the revenue collapsed away from him. That budget, and this is the first budget under Hockey, he couldn't get through a lot of measures, so that didn't bring us back into surplus. And now they're saying that we really won't get into surplus for about another 4 years. And the big issue is we've really got to start to put a lot more, we've got to really start to increase the amount of, this is the increased spending, this is just saying how much we've increased our spending over the last 6 years. So potentially what's happened is we've really had very little debt in Australia before. During the Howard years, the Gillard government run up and the Rudd government ran up a lot of debt, but to cut our spending back, this is just showing how much spending's gone up in the last few years. So we're really up there. A lot of other countries have pulled their spending back, whereas we're still spending like crazy. But one thing that's going to help is the Future Fund. Now, you probably know that a lot of the Future Fund was created under the Costello regime. They keep putting money in. This is why this figure here is they're actually putting money into that Future Fund every year for the budget. Eventually that money come out in 2020. That's when the actual money will start being drawn out from the Future Fund, and they'll be using that to fund public service pensions, which a lot of us have here today. And that pension then is not fully funded, but it will be largely funded through the Future Fund earnings. So it's currently 120 billion in there, and it should grow up. I think 120 billion should be by 2020, and that will actually fund all public service pensions. That'll actually cut in by 2020. That was one of the reasons why they're roughly getting back into surplus by 2020. It's not well sort of promoted, but that's the underlying story. But in the meantime, we've still got to put money into it to be able to draw money out of it later on. The biggest issue, of course, we said was the Senate, and the Senate locking and Senate measures, locking measures by the Senate to really pull back the amount of surpluses, and you can see it's been growing each year as you go through the years. The amount of extra cost the budget's got is really multiplying. So the next few years, or 4 years, we expect a further $82 billion in debt, bringing gross debt to $500 billion. Now that's around 50% of gross national product. When you get to around 80 to 90%, that's when you get problems. So really, it's starting to get a bit scary, but not too bad, because if you look at net debt, it's actually the net debt after things like the Future Fund, you take that off, it's not too bad. So if you look at the net debt, probably going to peak about 350 billion, which is about 35% of GDP. Still not high by international standards, but you don't need, it shouldn't be that high when you're starting to see a lot of people going into retirement when you need to get government spending to pay for retirees. So the things they've done, they've obviously hit people who are pensioners. That was the big hit, and that won't happen until 2017, but a lot of people in this room will probably lose their age pension. And it's based on the assets test. Now, not everyone will lose it, but it's not affecting the incomes test, so that's the big, a lot of people in Canberra are getting comp super pensions and they're assessed on the incomes test, so it won't affect you, but assets could. So what they're doing is two things. They're raising the threshold before you lose a pension. So under the proposed test, the threshold goes from something like so about 250,000 up to about 270,000. So you cut in at a higher level, but once you cut in, then it drops quickly. You lose a lot of pension very quickly. And that difference is that trajectory there is you lose $1.50 for every $1,000 of assets. This one's $3 for every 1,000 of assets. So it cuts out quicker, but they've actually raised the threshold a bit higher. Now, the purpose of that is that it will allow a lot more people to get a full pension at the bottom end, and they'll roughly on average get a $30 a week pay rise from a pay rise. So because they've raised the threshold. But once you get into the assets, you start to lose a lot more age pension. That's for couples. Singles, the same story, but I won't go into that, but basically get the story. So the basic story is for couples, it goes from a current threshold 286 to 375, so a bigger threshold before it starts, and then it cuts out at 823 rather than 1.1 million. So people in this category will be losing their age pension if they're in the assets test. For single people, 775, current assets test cut off now down to 547. So there's, I think, 170,000 people who will be affected and lose their age pension because of that change. But fortunately in Canberra, you've got comp super pension that doesn't go on the assets test. So for a lot of people, it won't affect you. So no change in income tax rates. Now, that sounds all good, but of course we've got to remember that wages go up every year, so you're going to get caught with bracket creep. That is, a lot of taxpayers will now be in the second highest category. So a lot of people will have in Canberra over $80,000 income, and their tax rate will be 37 cents plus 2% Medicare, so about 39%. So that's pretty high. Most people are going to be in this category, but you've got to remember it's only for every dollar over $80,000 that you get taxed on that. So for most people, it won't be devastating, but it's still going to push you into those higher tax brackets. We don't really have many people in the don't even see anyone in the $180,000 bracket. So a couple of things